Here is a blue-black ink by Sailor Shimoyo.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Depending on the paper, this can look very different. One of the reasons I like to use a bunch of different papers in these reviews. There is some tone variation by pen, and some of that isn't always for the best, as when it looks like it's more of a blue than a blue-black. As long as the pen isn't too wet, it shades well and does it well. I'm a fan of blue-black inks, and while this isn't exactly for me because of its blue lean at times, I would gladly use up a bottle of this and easily can see it being someone's really go-to ink. I think this is a fantastic ink and something that I hope has a lot of attention going to it.
The pen for today is
a Sailor 1911 standard.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine, you see that here it kind of looks more as a blue than a blue-black in a majority of the writing. Now, it is the lightest tone that we're going to get here, but I still think it holds on to some of the blue-blackness of it. Now, we get no feather and we get no spread, and it had better moments later on for shading, but it does shade very well. Look at had better on the first line. The H is a bit darker than the AD, and the B starts lighter. The E gets darker. The T's are just a tad bit darker than that E, but the ER at the end, much darker. And Tel, directly underneath that, starts lighter and works its way darker all the way through, really showing off the shading that this ink can perform. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It really gives that very dark blue, blue-black look to the color that's down there. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading, not tons of it because of how dark a majority of this is, but the shading shows itself very well in the word courtyard on the second line, where the C is quite a bit darker. It lightens up at the OU, R, and the T darken up again. The Y lightens, the A darkens, the R lightens, and the up and down stroke of the D, very dark. So there's not tons of it here, and mostly it comes across as that very dark tone. But we do get some of the shading, and I think it's pretty decent there. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread, but I think because of the slightly thicker line, the shading shows itself much better. Look at though on the first line, where the TH is very dark, the OU lighten up and the GA become, or GH become dark again. And there on the second line, the T is light, but the top of the H is very dark. The E starts dark, becomes light into the R, darkening up a little bit on the E at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading, I think, a little bit better as far as it's more stand out than we have in some of the other nibs. though it's mostly looking as a blue the way the soft fine did. The shading, when it's occurring, though, when you look at though on the second line, the T is light and the H gets very dark, and I really like that huge change that's happening right there. It lightens up out until you get to the GH at the end that are just a few steps darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, a little bit more blue as well. We get no feathering and we get no spread, though we do get some shading in though on the third line. Through on the third line. The THR is a bit darker than the OUG, which lighten up, and the H becomes much darker again. But even when it shades darker, it shades looking like a dark blue. And I almost wanted to go a bit darker than it does there. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading here that shows up, I think, a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine. When we see propped on the first line, the downstroke of the P is much darker than the loop of the P, and it stays lighter on the RO, and both of the next P's, those downstrokes are dark while the loops are light. Gets light into the E, very dark at the D. Now wooden on the second line starts light and works its way dark all the way to the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, a little bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, filled with opportunities to spot some shading, like filled with on the second line. The F is dark, but not its darkest. The I lightens up, and the first L is definitely much darker than the F and darker than the second L. It lightens up a little bit, and on the up and down stroke of the D, very dark, where with starts light and gets dark as you move through the word. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, bit lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get little flowering spots of shading that do occur. Take a look at it on the first line where the I is light and the T is very dark. Take a look at flowers on the third line where the F and L are mostly light, but when that L comes into contact with the G, it gets very dark. Mostly a lighter word as it moves through until the downstroke of the S at the end. And that is the word with probably some of the worst shading in it. There is a little bit, but I think most of what's here did much better than that. So looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get kind of a grayish tint to this blue. It's like a blue gray, not blue black. though it does shade pretty well when we look at his dangling legs. Get your mind out of the gutter. His is very dark, and dangling starts light, but on the L starts to darken up a bit. It looks very good, and looked on the fourth line, the L is darker. It lightens up on the OO, bit darker on the K, E, lightens at the beginning of the D, very dark at the end of the D. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. If you were wondering if we get shading, not really. Wondering on the first line is largely all one tone, which is most of what's here. But as you're getting towards the end, on the fourth line, you are going to see that coming over are both a bit lighter in tone than the words above them. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading, he said, looking at said the wizard on the first line, where said starts lighter, works its way darker. The is very dark and solid as a word, but wizard starts light, the Z gets a little bit darker into it, lightens up just a little bit until it gets to the D, the downstroke of that D becoming much darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the medium, bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no bother about shading. It certainly does like to bother the shading. Look at like to bother, first line. The like starts lighter, gets very dark at the KE at the end. Even 2 starts light and gets dark. Bother, the B is a midtone. It lightens up at the OT, but at the H it gets very dark, lightening at the E, darkening again at the R. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shrill moments of shading. It just needed the word shrill on the second line. The S is a little bit lighter than the H, R, and the I lightens a little bit. The L's at the bottom are darker and lighter at the top, where whistle starts light and works its way darker through most of that word. It's not as standout shading as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it certainly is nice shading that's happening. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get 1 or 3 moments of shading, or none, really. Looking at 1 or 3, you see all solid tone all the time. That's on the second line. No shading comes through here. It really looks as a dark, dark blue. So I guess we could even say, yes, a blue-black, just without shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading that shows up very nicely in dwarves on the first line, where the loop of the D is lighter than the up and down stroke, and the W lightens up a little bit. The AR gets dark and the VE light again until you get to the S when it gets dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a bit lighter than it was, quite a bit really, than it was with the medium nib. I want to say a tad bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading, thank you, though it doesn't show up as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Looking at thank you on the first line, the T is lighter than the H, and the AN are a nice mid-tone for what this ink gives, where the K gets very dark again. But U shows that it can write in one tone the whole way through, as it did there. It did it on said, it said it on Bjorn, but started to give a little bit of shading, going lighter to darker through the word. Looking at the back of the page, as you would expect, there is no bleeding and there is no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Teatramentis Deepwater Obsession Blue Black. Here is Noodler's Blue Black. Here is Pelican 4001 Blue Black. Here is Sailor Bunglebox 4B. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine and honestly looked like a different ink. This really looks like a gray into blue. Not a blue into black, a gray into blue. It has no feather and it has no spread. The shading that goes on there is respectable for this paper. Looking at respectable on the third line, where it starts lighter on the RES and the P darkens up a little bit, keeps it through the ECT, and the AB lighten up a little bit and the LE at the end become dark. But this tone is really not pleasing here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread, so no mischief there. Shading, looking at mischief on the first line, it starts lighter, gets darker at the I, lightens at the S. The chief becomes just a dark word. The thing to really notice here is the tone of the ink is entirely off for what would be a blue-black, but this paper is not always kind to keeping the color of an ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is only a tad bit darker than it was with the wet fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading, not by accident. When you look at accident on the first line, the A is lighter, the CCI and beginning of the D are a nice mid-tone, and the end of the D, ent, become darker, but nothing real dark. The darkest we see is like on that right next to it, where the T is light, the H is very dark, the A lightens up, and the T is very dark again. I do wish it did that shading much more frequently. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. And again, the tone here really unsatisfying and just not the fault of the ink. It's definitely an effect of the paper, but man, is this unsatisfying if it's a paper you frequently use. No feather, no spread, so both of those are good. Yes, it does shade. Look at the road that on the first line. The T is light, he is dark. Road is mostly light, except that up and down stroke of the D. That is mostly light, except the H is just a tad bit darker, and the T is much darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a brown ink by KWZ Iron Gall Gold. Here is a red ink by Diamine Vermilion. Here is an orange ink by Diamine Autumn Oak. Here is a magenta ink by Sailor Granat. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, and we do get some feathering and we do get some spread, and I don't think it's horrible in what's happening here. For if you want to use copy paper, I think you can with this nib. It's never going to be very nice. Speaking of shading, never very nice in what's happening. It does shade, but when it shades and gets darker, like never doesn't have nearly as much feathering until you get to the R where it darkens a bit. On very, the V is lighter, and the airy, which is darker shading, also has more feathers. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading, no real interest in how this is looking here. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tiny bit darker than it was with the wet fine nib, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering and we get spread, and we should not be surprised about that. When it comes to shading, there are a couple of moments that happen. Those moments bring more spread and more shading with them, like the H in there on the third line. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering and we get spread, and neither of those should be a surprise. We're not really getting some shading. There's maybe a moment you could choose that's a slight bit darker. At least the feathering and the spread are rather uniform in what's happening. The feathers aren't out of control. The spread is quite a bit, but it is copy paper. The good news is, without the shading, we can hope for less bleed through. Looking at the back of the page, you see that you probably could not write back here because you would have to fear losing both sides. That's just based on how deep the ink gets into the paper. Not that it's bleeding through, because it did not bleed through and touch the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine, while the lightest tone, isn't too light to read and does shade really well. The wet fine is almost the darkest tone, and because of that, the shading can be harder to spot, though it is there. The medium is just a tiny bit lighter than the wet fine, but that little bit helps it show more shading. And the broad was just a little darker than the dry soft fine, which is a whole lot lighter than that medium. And it does show shading well, but not as I would have expected, and that had more to do with the tone of the ink that I was getting there. So the color and the shading that I like the most from the medium flow and the medium nib. Another great choice is the dry fine, because the shading, even though the tone isn't the best, I think the shading is showing off very nicely.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.